Greetings and salutations. Good morning. We are in Deuteronomy, the 10th chapter for Sunday school. Want you to visit our website at wpbccleveland.com. And when you get to that website, which looks like this, I want you to go to the download for the weekly lesson, which is the heart of the law. If you will hit that download button, you will be right on track with our lesson and our study for this time this morning. I am going to scroll down to the search the scriptures, but before I do that, I want to read the key verse. And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. I want you to notice the word now, and I want you to notice the word this day. We've got to take God off a pause and let him do what he wants to do right now. God is still performing miracles right now in our midst. We're going to move by the scripture, Deuteronomy 10:12, and then 16:18. People and places, the background. We've done all of that. And we are going to move to the more light on the text, which should be in this very next section. There we are. All right. That is the text and the bold print. We have essentially the text that I just read. Let's go to the commentary. After Moses spent a second 40 days on top of Mount Sinai, he brought down a second pair of stone tablets inscribed by God with the Ten Commandments. He had thrown down and shattered the first set, which he came down from the mountain and discovered Aaron and the Israelite encampment worshiping a gold idol shaped like a calf. You have the text again, and I'm going to pick up where it says he began by asking the question that God's prophet asked the Israelites repeatedly in different ways. What doth the Lord require of thee? Micah, in essence, Moses' question was, if you're going to be one of God's people, what does that involve? Good question. What does God expect of you? Then in verses 12 and 13, he lists 5 responses that honored God's grace to them. First, fear him. The word Yahweh, fear, could mean dreading punishment or destruction. But just as often it meant feeling overwhelmed, awe, wonder, and amazement. The second meaning fits better here for those who choose to include themselves as one of God's people. As children, we may fear daddy's disapproval because of his size and strength. His size and strength are also our basis for confidence when we face problems or danger. Second, Moses said God asked his people to walk in his ways. To walk indicates the Israelites' actions. Trudging through the hot, dry desert was exhausting. Imagine doing that for 40 years, thirsty, hungry, or in danger. The word ways, Hebrew derek, could refer literally to a path or a road, but also figuratively to habits or behavior. Moses said God wanted his people to model themselves after him and his behavior towards them in all their relationships. In Deuteronomy 10:12, the third instruction for the Israelites was to love the Lord thy God by trusting him, being thankful for their deliverance from slavery and his forgiveness of their stubborn rebellion. Moses' fourth instruction in Deuteronomy 10:12 tells us how to express that loving trust and gratitude. Serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. It's easy to miss what Moses meant here. In English, we connect the heart with feelings, but the Israelites viewed the heart as the great thought and will. The soul, quote unquote, the nephesh, referred here to a person's seat of human passion and energy. Moses urged the Israelites to show their love for God by faithfully obeying God's will with all their energy and determination. In Deuteronomy 10:13, Moses summed up God's instructions in practical terms. Keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes. Commandments gave basic general instructions. Statutes referred to specific ways of applying those laws in various situations. To keep the Ten Commandments, the heart of God's law and other laws he gave for applying them, meant to obey them in the New Living Translation, to observe them in the NIV, and to keep them in the New American Standard Bible. Moses saved the most important truth for last. God said the intent behind all of his instructions was for thy good. Who would want to live in a world where it is easy, it was okay for people to steal, lie, or to be about each other, or kill each other? God wanted to pattern life among his chosen people on his caring and generous attitude towards them, to create a just world where each of them cared about each other as he cared about them. To heaven. But how often do we refer to the heavens and the heaven of heavens? What I'm trying to allude to here is that there is an abundant, unlimited, endless supply of everything in heaven. There is no suffering. There's no, according to Revelation, no sickness, no dying, no crying, no mourning. None of that is in heaven. And what heaven has is an unlimited supply. God says in this text, if you are struggling with keeping the statutes and all those other things, look to heaven. In heaven, there is everything. And of course, I'm going to revamp the Lord's Prayer because I think the emphasis is wrong. Thy kingdom come means come now. Thy will be done means done now, on earth as it is in heaven. If we want it done now on earth as it is in heaven, and we reread 14, behold, the heavens and the heaven of heaven is the Lord's, thy God, that means he has that for me. The earth also, that's for me. I'm his child. With all therein, I'm a benefactor of this. This is my inheritance, and I don't have to wait until I die to get it. Only the Lord hath delight in the fathers that love him. He chose their seed after them, even you above all people, as it is this day. I'm going to go to the commentary. Until recent times, people even that the world was flat, that the sun revolved around the earth, rather than vice versa. We're talking about just 500 years ago. During the 1800s, Reverend John Jasper preached for 20 years as a slave and for 20 more years as a free man after the Civil War. Crowds of thousands, black and white, came to hear. Expects us to understand and see his creation. The writer writes, likewise, Paul described his otherworldly vision as being caught up to. We've got the heavens, the heaven of heavens. We've got a third heaven. and their unlimited, endless, eternal supply of our every need. Why are we begging God when God has it for us? All we have to do is learn how to ask. The Gospel of Mark didn't. What an imagery. What an image. Moses declared what seldom crosses the minds of most of the world's population even today. The creator and the owner of all anyone can see and what we can still only imagine. God is immense. Deuteronomy 10:15 in the King James begins with the word only. At least 4 modern translations start with the verse that with yet. Both words are weaker than the one Moses used, which indicated that a complete contrast with what was just stated. He had a delight, the text says, in thy father's love. The word shashak is often translated love, but meant more than strong affection. Rather, it involved being actively committed to what you love, actively committed to what you love. From all God created, he was especially tied to the Israelites, not just to one generation of ex-slaves wandering in the wilderness. God wanted the Israelites to understand that he chose them from everything he had made as his chosen people. Interesting. We have verse 16 as it moves to the appointment of leaders. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm ahead of myself. In Israel early days, circumcision was performed not only on baby boys, but also on young men approaching puberty and marriage, as they became a part of God's covenant people. Exodus here, or it gives you sightings in Exodus and Genesis. Here, circumcision symbolized the intentional commitment to God, the knowing choice of an adult not an act performed on a hopeless newborn infant. To circumcise the heart symbolized a covenantal agreement and was intended to be permanent, life-altering change, a spiritual transformation in how an Israelite, especially a man, thought of a relationship with God. Moses used the word stiff-necked repeatedly to describe an obstinate unwillingness. Oops. That's helpful. An obstinate unwillingness, where are we? By Israel, giving God the love, faith, and obedience his grace toward them deserve. We have verse 17. As the Israelites plodded through Sinai desert, they encountered many nations. Each group worshipped a different god, some Molech, which is the devil, others Ashtoreth, and still more Shemash. Moses emphasized that whatever other gods there were, their God, the Lord, Yahweh, was the one true God. The people passed through the territories of many kings, including Balak, king of Moab, and king of Bashan, and Sihon, and king of the Amorites. Moses declared that many kings exerted lordly power over their people and nations, but the Israelites' God was Lord, supreme of all other lords. Here Moses explained the reasons for that claim. Their Lord was the only true God, not a minor God, and thus great in the extent of his influence. Mighty was used in Deuteronomy to describe a warrior in battle whose breadth and power would overcome whatever opposition he faced. The word terrible in Deuteronomy had the basic meaning of fearful, but here Moses referred to a trusting awe of their God because of his past powerful acts. Too often their treatment of other Israelites was influenced by the status of people seeking justice or by the possibility of material inducements. Their God's actions and judgments could not be swayed in these ways. On the contrary, their God shows no partiality. Without a father or a husband, children and women were especially vulnerable to abuse and injustice. But when God acts, he does so without any partiality for one person over another. That fairness applied to the stranger. Ger, a word in verse 18, which is often translated alien or foreigner, however, it didn't necessarily mean the person wasn't an Israelite. It could refer to an Israelite from another tribe. Anyone who was an outsider, someone with no property rights living temporarily or permanently in their midst. Not only could the outsider expect fair treatment from their God, Moses told them that God loveth the stranger, using some pattern he used toward the Israelites in verse 15. We see verse 19. I'm moving to the commentary. To share in God's holiness required sharing his merciful attitude towards people. Jesus made this heart of the gospel, the heart of the gospel. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love to one another. Again, using the same word that referred to his love for them. He instructs them to have love for the outsider. He reminds them that for hundreds of years they had been homeless, penniless outsiders in Egypt. I don't agree with the penniless. They knew the injustice and abuse such people went through. The New Living, the NLT of the Deuteronomy 10:19 pinpoints their duty as God's chosen people to embody love for the powerless outsider. You too must show love to foreigners, for you yourself were foreigners or once foreigners. I'm going back to where it says they were penniless. I know that they're expounding and they're painting the picture, but please be clear that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they took with them jewels, they took gold, they took skins, they took a large and a very significant amount of wealth out of Egypt before they left. They did not leave penniless. Do not allow for yourself to be drawn into a comparison of American chattel slavery with Hebrew Israelite slavery. They were not property. They were not counted among the animals and the cattle. They were enslaved, but it was a more, and it's an understatement of the year, it is a much more humane slavery. And as such, when they left, they received reparations immediately. And I believe that it is the church's job, and it should have been our job, to advocate for reparations, and we should be the leaders in letting the world know that we should have this reparations conversation. Let me say this and set this up. We find ourselves in conversations repeatedly with persons, sometimes even Asians and other Spanish, Portugal, Belgium, those kinds of people, and oftentimes we classify them as Europeans. Oftentimes today we want to get in a conversation where we say, "Oh, let's get along, let's play nice, and let's have harmony and unity." It is my estimation that that is a disrespectful conversation. You cannot have an economic advantage. I am constantly working from an economic disadvantage, primarily and factually and directly because my people have been enslaved in this country for 400 years. Your people have an economic advantage, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And we were legally set free and still had to continue as sharecroppers and second-class citizens, and those who were segregated by Jim Crow laws, redlining, grandfather clauses, poll tax, and the story goes on. And even today, we find ourselves as victims of predatory lending, poor schools, poor housing, 50 a disproportionate percentage of our people lead in AIDS, cancer, Alzheimer, and prison population. And all of that has a direct connection to the economic ramifications of living in a country as legal animals and being free legally with no reparations. The church ought to be leading the charge for reparations. And it is no one's business what is done with the money. What is done with money that is owed to somebody is owed to someone. And so we have a responsibility, as far as I am concerned, as a church, to lead the biblical charge for reparations for those of African descent all over the world, not just the United States, because the conditions that occur in Atlanta occur in London, and they occur in Australia. They occur in every center where there are persons of African descent in urban centers. And we haven't even begun the discussion of the reparations owed to Africa, and the fact that many Europeans today are still dependent upon the payments, the arrangements, and the taxes that they have put in place in perpetuity for those in Africa, West Indies, and so forth, to balance their economy for as long as possible. It is time to have a serious discussion about, it's past time, reparations. And it's owed. And when we consider historically that every other minority group who has been either oppressed or enslaved in the modern era has received direct reparations, and when we consider the fact that the Ukrainians are benefiting from reparations now, no law has been passed, and they are receiving reparations during war right now. They're receiving health care, Social Security, housing, protection, refuge right now in our country. And I have not heard the Trumpsters say a word. And so with that, let's be clear that the children of Israel were not wandering around in the wilderness penniless. We just read Leviticus, we just read Numbers, and we're reading now when Moses came down from the mountain, and before he came down from the mountain, Aaron asked for their gold to make a calf. They were not penniless. They built a tent that was extravagant and elaborate, made of stones and jewels and silver and gold and bronze, and this all came from a free will offering of the people. They were not penniless. I'm emphasizing this because no one in the modern era ought to be forced to be impoverished. No one. All poverty can be eliminated in the global system with a blink of an eye. Poverty is big business, number one, and poverty is unnecessary, number two. And so we find ourselves living a lie. Urban, modern ghettos should not exist. There should be adequate housing and education and resources for everyone in America. Let me say one other thing. We now have armies that travel the world, and they set themselves up in no man's land. We did it in Vietnam. We did it in Korea. We did it in Afghanistan. We did it in Kuwait. They literally go in and they build army bases, which are the equivalent of modern cities. Everything that you would find in a modern city, they can put in the middle of the desert. Housing, schools, libraries, even churches, airports, irrigation system, electrical system, all of that, they can create a city. If they can create a city in the middle of nowhere, they can fix the cities that exist right now. And it is a farce. It is a lie. It is a misnomer that we must negotiate with poverty. All right. Having said that, let's move on. 20, thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, etc., etc., etc. To uphold God's awe-inspiring greatness, confirm their belief in his fearful power. Faithful pursuit of his express will and purposes nail down the reality of that belief. Taking a sworn oath in the Lord's name, declared acceptance of God as their highest authority. Talk about God's grandeur meant little unless it was backed up in truth or in righteousness. In Deuteronomy, Moses urges them to cleave or hold tightly to that belief. Later in Deuteronomy, he charged them to hold fast, for the Lord is your life. We look at verse 21. It talks about praise and the fathers in Egypt and how the Lord has fulfilled his promise. The word praise in Deuteronomy meant hymn of praise. The word hallelujah is derived from the Hebrew. Scholars debate whether the praise mentioned here was for God or Israel. Both were true. God's acts of delivering them from slavery and sustaining them in spite of hunger, thirst, and enemies brought them worry, respect. Yet in spite of their fearful stubbornness, their life-saving deliverance came only about because of God's grace through visible acts of power. It is undeniable that God miraculously engineered their exodus from Egypt and provided for them their sojourn in the Sinai desert. Moses reminded them that God had sustained them through the years of abusive treatment and multiplied their numbers and strength for a new future. God had braced the Israelites through centuries of slavery and mistreatment for a greater future. By doing so, he demonstrated his great love and power. We move into the appointment of judges, and I want to talk about this a little bit during the 11 o'clock hour. But this brief passage lays out the guideline God gave in his covenant with Israel and Mount Sinai for building a just society. Look at those words, a just society. Judges and officers refer to those who decided on how to handle disputes and those who enforce judges' decisions. Several modern translations of Deuteronomy 16:18, such as those versions we're familiar with, use the word appoint. Judges and officers were specified intentionally setting persons in a particular place. In other words, both judges and their assistants were to be chosen with care for fairness and honesty. Moses inserted a reminder that their land was a gift from God. Do not underestimate that. By their covenant with God, they obligated themselves to abide by his laws and apply them to all persons and circumstances. The mention in Deuteronomy of all thy gates and throughout thy tribes shows that God intended to ensure justice both locally and nationally. We move to our final couple paragraphs. We look at verse 19, which I want you to pay attention to that word rest. I also want you to note that I have some challenge with this notion that while they were in the wilderness, they were hungry and they were thirsty. According